FutureSense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nyck Jeanes and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, FutureSense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is FutureSense. It's amazing that it's December and this year, 2018, seems to have sped by and so much has happening and is happening and so many changes are occurring. I wonder how you particularly feel about it. And as I said, if you'd like to text in at any point, what we're really interested in is your sense of the future. This is FutureSense. How are you feeling in response to those external things and the internal things that are also going on inside of you? Because there's so much to make sense of. There is so much to make sense of. And sometimes it's important to get guidance, and we all need guidance, I guess, of one type or the other, whether it's your partner or someone that you might go and see, or a book that you might read, or some element that you might experience when you're in nature, for example. Talking to a tree is also always a good thing, or a bubbling stream. I was just up on the Sunshine Coast over the weekend, and with my partner, and we had a beautiful weekend in the bush there. And for sure, that moment when silence kind of overcomes the noise in your head enough to stop and to be still and allow things to come through. But you've been in a different environment, Steve, last week, down in Tasmania, and experiencing the channel Kryon. Lee Carroll, who I think started channeling in about 1989, when he was kind of pushed or forced by spirit, as he said, to
something like that,
to speak what came through him with this entity called Kryon.
Yes, and this talk may sound rather strange to some people out there.
Good.
Talking to trees and those sorts of things and channeling. But Lee Carroll is an interesting character. He's an engineer by trade, so he doesn't come from a New Age background or anything. And I'm not sure exactly how he started channeling, but I'm sure it came as a surprise to him and the people around him.
Yeah.
And he speaks, or he allows an entity, a personality called Kryon, to speak through him. So it's Kryon, if you haven't heard of Kryon. And as you said, this has been going on for a long time, I think 30 years or almost, thereabouts. Including
some time when he's been invited to speak at the United Nations a number of times, which is interesting.
So 14 books have been written directly containing Kryon's channelings, and Australian author Monica Moranyi, who was also in Hobart, and I understand she travels with Lee Carroll as an assistant, and she's compiled a number of other books, so there are more than 14 books. All of the books that Monica has compiled also contain channelings of Kryon as well, and I think Lee Carroll's actually saying in Hobart that Monica's done an amazing job of cataloguing the various topics that have been in various channelings, and compiling them quite expertly in these extra books that have been published under her name. And Kryon's and Lee Carroll, rather, and Monica, accompanied by Kryon, I'm sure, are on a national tour of Australia at the moment, and they've done 10 channelings in different places around the country. I think they started in Brisbane, and the most recent ones were in Hobart, and I believe they're on a bit of a holiday, like they do tours wherever they go.
They do holidays.
Yeah, they invite people to go on tours of different places that they're visiting, for days at a time, and I think Kryon stops and channels in various spots during the tour, and I think he's doing that in some lovely scenic spots in Hobart. And I'm sure we'll hear those recordings in due course also.
I think his last book you've read, haven't you, called The New Human? I think 2017, The Evolution of Humanity, which is really what he's talking about along the way always, but particularly now when we've got this incredible pressure for change, you could say, going on.
Yeah. It's the only Kryon book I've ever read, actually, and I found it very interesting. And like all of the books that have been directly published by Lee Carroll, they're just a recording of the actual channeling. So they come from various places and various times. But some really interesting information in that book, The New Human, which is book 14, Kryon's book 14. If you're interested in looking at that,
yes,
I can recommend it.
So what's he saying? I mean, because I know you told me off air this morning that he's been detailing some of the prehistory of humans as we now find ourselves.
Yes.
Some of that deeper history. Do we want to go there? Folks, if you're ready for a little bit of out there in the galaxy, out there in the stars, and I'm sure you are.
That's right, yes. If not, hang on to your seat. This might be somewhat unexpected, but all of his channelings so far during this trip to Australia have been around the subject of consciousness, which has been very interesting, considering that we talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
And he's talked about the idea of consciousness being like a box that you're experiencing the world from inside of, and in terms of it being a box, he says that it can be impermeable to outside input, so we can kind of get stuck in a box and just think a certain way and be rigid in our value sets and those sorts of things and not open to change. And he's talking about the possibility of you changing that arrangement of your consciousness into what he's calling a semi-permeable bubble. So, like a flexible balloon.
Sounds softer, doesn't it?
It does. It certainly does.
Yeah, more amenable to travel.
And I'm sure it comes in more variety of colours as well.
Yeah, hopefully.
And this semi-permeable bubble would be like a balloon that can expand or contract as appropriate, and things can pass through the membrane of the bubble. Is what he's suggesting, and this, of course, equates directly to a concept in Clare Graves' research, which he called the being open or closed to change. And he said, Clare Graves said in his research, he found that people were usually or always in one of three different conditions. They were either permanently closed to change, so they were kind of like in a box, as Kryon would said, and they, you can give them new information, but it just doesn't impact their values or their behaviour.
Just does not land.
And Graves gave an example of how that might play out in someone's behaviour. It's kind of like the idea of only having a hammer as a tool, and so you think everything's a nail, and so even when you're faced with a completely different challenge, you still hit it with a hammer.
I thought we're already onto politics, or already onto coalition politics.
Well, it's all relevant. It's all connected, as you know.
Oh dear.
It's all connected. So someone who's closed, permanently closed, applies the same thinking and solutions to every challenge that they encounter, regardless of whether it's the same old challenge or a completely new one. And we've all met somebody like that or seen them on TV. And another one of the conditions that Graves identified was someone who might be temporarily arrested. So this would equate to, in Kryon's language, someone being temporarily in a box, who may be able to change at some point given the right triggers. And that's really who Kryon's been addressing some of his channelings to during this trip to Australia, is somebody who might be temporarily stuck or arrested, who are sort of contained in a box in terms of their values, their behaviours, their ways of interacting with the world, and who might be triggered perhaps by a channeling from an extraterrestrial entity named Kryon.
Maybe so. And as you say, I guess it relates to, as we talk about often, to Graves' work, where the challenge of growth and evolution occurs, where life conditions, pressures happen, and one tends to slip backwards into that box where it's been more comfortable, where we think that we've succeeded before, where we think we've solved the problems of our existence and so forth. So it's a bit of a retrogressive step, but then so there's a possibility of opening that back up again, and I guess making people feel safe and inspired to accept and receive new information.
Yeah, so as you're indicating there, this often happens during a period of significant change where we'll regress to old values, and those old values may well be very rigid and unchangeable, at least temporarily. And then the third condition that Graves identified was being open to change. So this equates to being what you might call a complex adaptive system, an open system, which is open to input from outside its boundaries, which is able to respond to that input in relevant and constructive ways.
Even if it's uncomfortable input, I guess that's the secret.
Absolutely, yeah. And often, that's exactly the kind of input that requires change of you, and who's also capable of digesting that external input and actually changing, their core values at a very deep level.
Changing the core values at a very deep level. That's a big ask.
It is a big ask, and it's what's known as transformational change because it transforms who we are.
And it is what is absolutely necessary on this planet now.
It's what a lot of people are going through right at the moment, exactly. So that was very interesting, and it was interesting for me to listen to Kryon's language and just try and translate his concepts into what I've studied of Graves's work to really get a feel for what he's actually talking about.
Yeah.
That was good. And then when we went to the event in Hobart, which was at the Rest Point Casino, an interesting venue, it was. And I think I get the impression that they actually do these events they select these venues because they go in the hope of sort of taking a different energy into the place and perhaps distracting people from the poker machines to think about deeper issues, I guess. So during the event, which went for, I guess it must have gone for about 3.5 hours, there were just 2 channelings, each of which were only about 15, 20 minutes long. So there was a lot of other time. And during that other time, both Lee Carroll and Monica Miranyi gave talks. And those talks weren't recorded. They're not normally published as far as I know. So you can only sort of hear these things by going along to the event. So I'm glad that I did go along, because one talk that Lee gave was very interesting, and Monica also, I think, contributed to this topic as well, and that was on the history of modern humans.
Yeah.
A very unconventional history. And just in brief, here's the story that Lee related, and this information is not stuff that Lee's made up. It's come from Kryon's channeling, so it's solid in that respect. And for those of you who haven't heard me talk about Kryon before, I often mention Kryon as one of the sources that I had paid attention to for the last few years. And part of the reason for that is because in my analysis of the information that he's conveying, I've never really been able to fault his way of conveying it or the actual subject matter. I've never found anything that contradicts it, that comes from a reliable source. So in talking about the history of modern humans, Lee said that 200,000 years ago, according to Kryon, some extraterrestrial folks from the Pleiades constellation.
The Seven Sisters.
Yeah, they came visiting, and he talked about how this idea of the Seven Sisters is recorded in many, many different indigenous mythologies.
In so many. It's incredible.
Our own here in Australia, and he mentioned specifically visiting Uluru in that region there and seeing artwork portraying the Seven Sisters. And he said that there was an intervention made at that time, 200,000 years before the present, whereby female extraterrestrials from this delegation interbred with local males, thus creating a hybrid type of human. Very interesting idea.
Very interesting idea. Immediately you think of sort of interstellar feminism and the notion that the female component is the saviour. I'm extending here.
I know. Well, it raises.
I think we could.
There are all sorts of things that we could talk about in relation to this. One of the things that it made me think about is this. And I don't know if there's any science or solid information to back this up, but I've often had the impression that women at certain ages are often more evolved, it would seem, than men in their values.
Absolutely. I'm convinced of this.
Yeah,
I'm convinced of this. I've actually felt and thought that way for quite a long time.
Yeah.
That women at whatever age I might be, that I meet in that sort of general age group, will tend to be a lot more aware, conscious, advanced. Of course, as a generalisation, there's always exceptions, but overall, yes.
And I think it's
pretty clear, really.
Pretty well acknowledged in the education system, at least, that women tend to mature faster than men, in terms of their values.
Which you could argue is why men have had to use their often more brute strength and sort of dumbed down sort of box-like opinions to try and rule things and control the world, which we've done a very good job of.
It's not that they've had no choice.
That's right. If you're not smart enough, what else can you do? Girls,
so
save
really
us, please.
That was really interesting, and I'm sure we've sparked a few conversations out there in listener land this morning with our comments there. But he did. Lee also referred to some work by Greg Braden, who's an American author and speaker and scientist who talks about these things. Lovely guy, Greg. I've had opportunity to talk to him a couple of times, and in I think it's his most recent book called Human by Design, he's talking about these things called fused telomeres.
Fused telomeres.
Yes.
Telomeres that are fused together.
That's right. Now, just a warning to our listeners here, we're ranging far outside our
Scientific knowledge.
Scientific knowledge and competency here, so just bear with us and don't try this at home, whatever you do. But apparently our genes, I'm talking about human genes here, contain DNA, and these DNA strands are on chromosomes. And help me out here, Nick, if I get stuck.
I will.
And with these telomeres are actually...
well, they're structures at the end of the chromosomes, aren't they?
Exactly.
I think they lessen as you get older. I think that's part of an indication of aging. In fact,
Yes.
when the telomeres sort of shorten for a start.
Yeah, so the big deal is that in gene number 2, or is it chromosome number 2? Sorry, chromosome number 2 in our 23 chromosome pairs that we have as humans, there's something unusual in chromosome number 2, something that's not found in the other ones. And what it is it looks like 2 strands have been fused end to end. So in Wikipedia, it actually says human chromosome 2 is a result of an end-to-end fusion of 2 ancestral chromosomes. And this is very unusual. It's not found in any of the other chromosomes. And like I said, these telomeres normally sit on the end of the strands, but in this particular chromosome 2, the strand has 2 fused telomeres right in the middle of it, as well as telomeres on the end.
And chromosome 2 is also the second largest human chromosome, so it's obviously very powerful in its...
A lot of information there.
A lot of information there, yes.
Yeah. So getting back to Lee Carroll and his talk, so he's saying that this chromosome 2 is the result of this interbreeding between extraterrestrials and our ancestors at 200,000 years ago.
Well, this is actually in Wikipedia, not the part of the extraterrestrials, but it's. I didn't know this. All members of Hominidae, if they pronounce that badly, except humans. So Neanderthals and Denisovans have 24 pairs of chromosomes, but humans have only 23, because number 2 is a result of an end-to-end, as you're saying, fusion of 2 ancestral chromosomes. So yeah, that's unusual. There's no explanation in Wikipedia or the straight science about this or how that came about or why.
No, and this really equates to the missing link, which everyone talks about in our ancestry, that they haven't quite figured out what went on around that time. So the solution, according to Kryon, is that there was an intervention by these folks from the Pleiades constellation who interbred, and particularly women ETs interbreeding with local males, and resulted in this fused telomere in our DNA.
I've got some friends around here who think that's happened to them here in this region.
Really?
Being bred by alien women.
Let's not go there. And just to continue the history.
We're feeling cheeky today, folks.
So this history, for the next 110,000 years, it seems that things were left to develop naturally. Yeah. But by 90,000 years ago, only hybrid humans remained. So all of those ancestors who didn't take part in this interbreeding with the ETs apparently died out during those 110,000 years. And the only folks that were left, the only humans that were left, were hybrids by 90,000 years before the present time. And then at 50,000 years ago, there was a bunch of Pleiadians who established a settlement on the planet and cohabited and quite likely continued interbreeding, I guess, with the locals here on Earth. And Lee Carroll spoke specifically about the lost continent of Lemuria.
Lemuria, yes.
Which he says was actually what is now Hawaii. And at that time, 50,000 years ago, there was a lot more land mass there. And interestingly, that period, 50,000 years ago, equates in Claire Graves's work to the emergence of the second layer of human evolution.
The first tribal expression of human
which equates
experience.
To traditional tribal life. And this was also a time in history when there was a sudden explosion of culture, art and the like, which hadn't existed previously, but all of a sudden just suddenly appeared. And again, that's another question, in our history, is why suddenly 50,000 years ago did we start producing cultural items where we hadn't done it for the previous 150,000 years. So this could be the explanation, folks. And from 50,000 years ago till about 30,000 years ago, the we continued to have these ETs coexisting with us on the planet, according to Kryon. 30,000 years ago, the civilization on Lemuria was at its peak. And since then, he said, there have been 5 different human civilizations that flowered and then were mostly lost or destroyed. So this could relate to, he didn't really go into much detail around which civilizations those were, but it could equate to people like the Maya, for example, and similar civilizations that have been found, where we found the remains, the buildings, but there's a question mark over what happened to them or where they went or who their ancestors are, to some extent at least. And he said they were mostly destroyed. He didn't say they were entirely destroyed, so that implies that there were some survivors that continued on from these different civilizations. But it kind of implies perhaps a few false starts or things that were civilizations that were perhaps destroyed by natural events.
So overall, is he suggesting that we are, as many people have claimed and expressed in various ways, that we're an experiment of some sort on this planet? We've been fiddled with sort of supposedly, in inverted commas, natural evolution.
In the nicest way.
It's very nice to be fiddled with in the right way. All of us would agree with that. I think that's very true. It's very nice to be touched and to touch and to love. It's such a shame that touch has become, political statement. Anyway, that's another topic.
Yes,
we're very cheeky
today.
Yeah, we're getting off the track. Come, bring it back.
Anyway, so these 5 different human civilizations since 30,000 years ago, which have mostly been lost or destroyed, and then about 15,000 years before the present time, the continent of Lemuria mostly sank under the ocean, and that was the result of underwater volcanic activity. There was apparently a large bubble of magma which had swelled up and raised all of this landmass above sea level for quite a long time, collapsed. And then it all sank again eventually, and so most of the continent of Lemuria sank under the ocean.
Quite possibly the origins of the Great Flood myth.
Yes, certainly. In fact, Lee mentioned that this is one of the things that contributed to what he called the myth of Atlantis.
Yes,
and Kryon has said that the idea of Atlantis wasn't a single event, but it's kind of a story that's been compiled as a result of multiple incidents over the long-term period of history where land masses have sunk under the water, islands have sunk, and that's kind of been recorded in our memory.
Yeah.
And some folks who were in Lemuria at that time, 15,000 years ago, when this big sinking of the island happened, escaped to other places, other islands in the Pacific. New Zealand was mentioned, and that place where it's got the big statues.
Easter Island,
was another place. And really, that was pretty much the end of the story, or the long-term story of human history that Lee was relating there. But very, very interesting.
And what's his summary about that? I mean, what does that? Is the sense that you got, or what did he say about that? About why we are now at this point in time with that prehistory that we are not aware of, and yet there are many claims of this type. Often sort of in sync with this, often sort of related to this kind of notion of alien seeding of this planet, of star seeds coming here. All of that package, to me, is really interesting. To know exactly what the truth is one thing. It'd be very nice to absolutely know what happened here, but more so on a kind of on a trans-rational level, what this means for us now. And how these kind of ideas, which are definitely being infused more and more with more people on the planet more often, more people are receiving and accepting or listening to these kind of ideas. They're receptive. Their box is not so closed. What's the purpose of this, you think?
I think the purpose is that if we look at human evolution, and particularly from a source like Claire Graves' research, we can see that as we grow through these different layers of consciousness, each layer has a particular scope of interest and understanding and influence. And at the lower layers, that scope is relatively small. Like in our hunter-gatherer days, we were mostly interested in a very small piece of land that we used to roam around on, a very small social group, and there was a limit to the amount of influence that we could have on our world. And that has gradually increased with each layer of consciousness. Our scope of interest, our capacity to influence things has expanded with each layer. And here we find ourselves at this time in history with many people having a scope of interest that encompasses the entire planet, and many of us even having the capacity to influence things, around the planet, which with such simple things as a social media post, for example.
Yeah.
Which can spread like a virus around the planet and influence many millions of people in a very short space of time. And so I think it's very appropriate at this time in history that this kind of information is being introduced, because we have really, for the first time in a long time, we have the capacity to actually digest it. We've got this large-scale interest, which for some people is extending off the planet. I mean, look at Elon Musk and his plans to fly to Mars, for example.
Yeah, well, we've just landed a satellite on Mars anyway, so we've already begun that process of extending even further out physically from this realm.
Exactly, we have. So, it's a very relevant time in our history for us to be fed information which may be true.
Yes, I think that's the point here, is whether or not this is specifically true or not. This particular version, what is interesting is that it gives more and more people, as you're saying, in this global frame that we now exist in, the potential to imagine, to encompass, to expand and allow and embrace bigger versions of ourselves, I guess. Bigger ideas about ourselves and who we are on this planet.
Who we are, where we come from, what we're capable of.
Yes, all that.
Exactly. The thing that I find particularly interesting is that this information links with so many other little bits of information that we have about our past, which have been largely unexplained. I mean, I can think, as a youngster, seeing the TV documentary about von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods.
Oh, yeah.
When that shortly after his book came out, and all of the different civilizations that we've found, the buildings that we've found around the planet that have been built with technology that we don't have right now. These massive blocks of rock that have been placed so amazingly exactly that in ways that we couldn't do with even today's technology. It's something. There's something lost from our history that we don't have, and this may be part of that missing piece.
And it's amazing that we have such an incredible blind spot to those very things, that some of these structures, like the Great Pyramids of Egypt and other places, and other structures like that, and some of these prehistories, we somehow we've just closed the door up until this time, most of the time, on actually receiving some of that and going like, well, that's a very big question. How was something like that built, supposedly 5,000 years ago, but probably much older? How did that happen?
Yeah.
And for most people, they just don't even want to ask that question. But it's changing, clearly.
It is changing.
We're expanding into a different version of ourselves, evolving.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're in a future sense. Spiral up. Indeed. That's what we're doing. We're talking a little bit about Steve's experience down with the channel Lee Carroll of the entity Kryon, and a little bit more about that before we move on.
In Hobart recently, and if you're interested in listening to Kryon's channels, you can go to kryon.com, that's Kryon.com, and follow the free audio link there, and you'll see on the 2018 links, the most recent ones are all from Australia during his current visit. And also, I might mention something that Lee said when we were in Hobart, and that is that there are a lot of links to which purport to be to Kryon channelings on YouTube. And he said that these are not official links, and they're actually clickbait used by people who are trying to earn advertising money by using Kryon's name and sometimes even Kryon's registered logo. So stay away from the YouTube stuff. And if you want to listen to the genuine Kryon channelings, go to Kryon.com and listen to the audio there. Now, we've been talking a little bit about the channelings which mention human consciousness and how it's changing, but also about another talk which I heard when I was at the event in Hobart, which was presented by Lee Carroll and the Australian author Monica Moranyi. And it's about the history of modern humans, and this is not in the recordings. You actually have to attend the event to get access to this kind of stuff, but it's very interesting, and it's suggesting that modern humans are the result of extraterrestrial intervention in our evolution, which began 200,000 years ago, around the time that the first modern humans appeared, according to science. And we've spoken about how that played out. Kryon has said in his channelings that Pleiadians, in other words, extraterrestrials from the Pleiades constellation, visited the planet around 200,000 years ago. Their female members interbred with local males, producing what were the first modern humans. And then around about 50,000 years ago, settlements were actually established on the planet, which included Pleiadians living here amongst us, and no doubt interbreeding with us and teaching us.
And you're still here, some of you. We know who you are.
That's right. We have your numbers. Primarily on the continent of Lemuria, which was in the same location as modern-day Hawaii. In fact, I understand that what is now Hawaii is the remnants of this ancient continent of Lemuria, which sank into the ocean and contributed, no doubt, to the myth of Atlantis. Then around about 15,000 years ago, Lemuria sank, which really ended that major civilization together with the ETs. Some folks escaped to other islands in the Pacific, and the information of those events is recorded in a lot of Indigenous history. And as we mentioned at the start of the show today, that includes in our own Indigenous history here in Australia, where Lee Carroll mentioned going to Uluru and looking at the artwork there, which depicted the Seven Sisters in the artwork. So it's really interesting. Something else he said during that talk was that before the time of Christ, so before about 2,000 years ago, life on the planet was lived according to a system of law. He used the terminology according to the dispensation of law, but what that meant was the system of law. And I guess that's a reasonable comment when you look at Graves' work, and we see that with the emergence of tribal society came law, L-O-R-E, and customs, which is equates to what we call LAW law these days to some extent. And eventually, with the agricultural revolution around about 10 or 12,000 years ago, what we know as modern day law began to emerge. As we started to live in larger settlements and cities, we needed laws to live by.
Became more codified.
Exactly. And often, particularly in the earlier days, that law was religious law. It was like a set of rules to follow, as in the Ten Commandments, for example. And then that changed with Jesus Christ arriving about 2,000 years ago, according to Kryon and his channel Lee Carroll. And it swapped from living according to the law to living according to love. And as we know, according to some of the books, Christ, a big part of his teaching was about the Sacred Heart.
Love thy neighbour.
Exactly.
As yourself.
Yes. And then more recently in 2012, Lee was saying that this shifted once again to living according to compassion.
Yeah.
So there are three sort of big eras that he's identified there: an era of law, an era of love, and an era of compassion.
That's very interesting. So we're now in that era of compassion.
Yes.
And seeking to find that compassion between each other, which is the difficult thing for many still, and yet many others now are able to feel compassion, as you've said to me, for those who you've never met before. Those in various situations in the world, dire situations, life conditions really impacting badly and with great difficulty, wars, famine and so forth, that we're actually able to feel those people now more than we ever have been able to before, perhaps.
That's right. And this sequence or progression that Lee Carroll describes certainly fits with the evolutionary story from scientific research. Because in our early evolutionary days, our sensory perception was a little bit more limited than it is today, and so we didn't necessarily have the capacity to connect at a heart-centered level with another human being, and so we therefore had to be given a law to follow, right, which was a rational-minded kind of a thing, or at least something that we could remember and follow according to custom, which might not necessarily be a rational-minded process.
You even see this, just as an aside, I'm thinking now of the various period dramas one might watch on television, Downton Abbey or these kinds of things, or going further back even, so we even talking about 100 or 200 years ago, but certainly even further back, the codes of behaviour in engaging with another being, especially of the opposite sex, but not just, was almost painful to watch that now.
Yeah, exactly, like a rigid rule set that was followed and had to be followed. Because
and so everything took a lot of time to just connect to someone else.
Yeah, exactly. And then progressing from there to developing this capacity to connect heart to heart with another human being in your presence.
Yeah.
Which equated to what Kryon was saying about Christ's teachings. And then compassion, of course, extends that really to be able to engage in a heart-centered way, or at least identify in a heart-centered way with a human who's not in your presence. like a third or fourth person connection,
Yeah.
which equates to really where we're at globally at the moment, in terms of our emerging capacity as humans.
It's very interesting. We were talking, my partner and I were talking a little bit about this area, I think yesterday or so, and how the notion of gossip that we call, gossip in the past and still, of course, is what it is. It can be a distortion of truth for various purposes that one person might be perpetrating that bit of gossip, a bit of manipulation, or trying to, find themselves in a position of more power or whatever they might be doing. But it would seem to me that nowadays the way that we talk with each other, those of us who are becoming more awake one way or the other, is really a sharing that enables more compassion at its best. I mean, there's always it's always going to be polluted a little bit by one's own desires and egocentric, Maybe. Well, except for you, of course, present company accepted. But I think there's a great truth to that, is because we were saying how it's not great to talk about another person, but if you're doing it out of a sense of trying to engage to enhance a person's view of someone or a situation, and doing it with kindness and love at the core of it somewhere, then it's a different sort of thing that's going on there. Somewhere we're practicing compassion, I would suggest.
It is, and this capacity for compassion is really emerging at this very moment with this new layer of human consciousness that we talk about often on the show, this sixth layer, which is just beyond the modern scientific industrial layer. And this is perhaps the biggest contrast that we're seeing in politics at the moment, is do our politicians have the capacity for compassion or not? And we're seeing a massive contrast right now in relation to issues like the refugees on Nauru, for example, whereby some politicians can clearly express and experience compassion, and some clearly can't.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we should name names, but maybe we should. I mean,
they're not going to be in Parliament much longer if the coalition has any sense to itself, which is dubious.
Minister Dutton is a classic example of a human being who is operating at best from the fifth layer of consciousness, which is the modern scientific industrial, whereby he undoubtedly loves his family and immediate relations and close friends, perhaps. There's no question of that. But when it comes to extending that loving feeling into compassion and applying it to people that he's never met and who are remoted locately, then it's just not there. It's completely absent. And yet you take another politician like, for example, Richard Di Natale from the Greens, who clearly is able to experience that compassion. Yes,
indeed.
Yeah. And that is perhaps one of the major differences that we're seeing in politics right at the moment.
And that's right. And that is probably, arguably, one of the biggest tensions right there, and not just, of course, in Australian politics. We see exactly the same thing with Trump and the Mexicans, or or supposed terrorists, or whatever. We're seeing it in the UK, large numbers of European countries, many countries around the world, expressing this battle between those who can feel this compassion and those who seemingly cannot.
Yes.
Very difficult tension, because if you can feel that, you just cannot understand why someone else can't feel that.
No, and the temptation is often to say, well, these are bad people. They're not good people. But in really, scientific terms, that's not correct. I mean, these are people who don't have the capacity, haven't developed the capacity yet, because they haven't been exposed to sufficiently complex life conditions to cause them to grow into that. And so, to truly look at this in a compassionate way, we have to understand that these are folks who don't have the capacity yet to do that. It's not that they have it and they're choosing not to. It's that they simply can't do it. They haven't got the operating system.
So it requires a degree of compassion for those of us who can feel compassion for those people who can't feel compassion, which is a bit of a paradox, and part of the way that we actually have to align ourselves now on this planet to try and make sense of and begin to create a value system and policies that then emerge from that in terms of governance and so forth, that reflect that ability in us.
That's right, because if we fall into the trap of saying that these are bad people, or these are people who are worse than us because they're not doing this, we're actually falling back into these old value systems which don't express compassion.
And you probably find that if you do that, because I know that's true for me when I get a bit aggressive about injustice in particular, one sort or the other. And
before your morning coffee, you mean?
Before my morning coffee, that calms me right down. Or, I'm not sure. But, that it doesn't feel good to be on the attack against those who don't feel compassion or other things that we think they should feel, or why can't they feel it? It doesn't feel good to actually feel this against this push against it.
No.
So that should be a very telling sign for those who.
I think so, and it's an important point. But for people, sorry, I'll start again. Particularly for people who are sort of on the edge of moving into this compassionate space, and who are there sometimes and not all the time, and it can be very confusing, that they don't feel good when they express their opinions in that way that's not compassionate. But this is actually this is what's going on. As a race, we are really on the cusp of moving into a new era, which will be characterised by this compassion.
And I think that sort of cognitive dissonance that you may feel in that situation is a really good signpost that you're on the right track, in the sense of, how do you reapproach, redesign, realign yourself to a bigger place inside of yourself that you already know exists.
Yep.
But you fall back into that other place too often.
Yeah, and that feeling of discomfort that might come when compassion is not expressed is really it's an evolutionary tension that's guiding you into a more compassionate place.
Yes. Thanks for your text, which are going back to some of the stuff we were talking about before. So maybe I'll just throw that very quickly before we move on. One writer wrote, what about, we're talking about things that were built by, or who built them, how were they built? And this person mentions a place called Coral Castle. You ever heard of this?
Oh yeah.
Built in the US last century of massive blocks of coral by one man, which he later moved to a different location. A very unusual, impressive building, and I think he did leave some record of how he moved those big blocks around, I think, but it doesn't quite stack up compared to the Great Pyramid at Giza.
Still
pretty amazing. I looked at some photos just before here. And another piece here, there is also strong evidence that people escaped from a sinking landmass, supposedly Mu or Lemuria, to what is now South America, based on archaeological findings in SA, in South America. Yeah. That's right. Well, there are so many pieces, and I think that's a key to all of this stuff. There's so many pieces arising all over the place now. New discoveries, new approaches, science that can analyse these structures and these ways of being and the age of things and so forth. So we're seeing continuing revolutions of all that material.
We are, and in the absence of solid scientific evidence which ties all these things together, it really is worthwhile considering information that comes from sources like Kryon, for example. And Kryon has a very, very good record of predicting scientific breakthroughs before the fact. So it's certainly well worth our attention. One of the other things that Kryon talks about, of course, is climate change.
Climate change, yes. Yeah,
and his opinion is somewhat contrary to the mainstream idea of global warming.
And to most of you out there, probably too.
Yeah, exactly. He's talking about long-term cooling and not long-term warming rather.
Yeah,
and he's one of a number of sources that I've been following for some years now on this track of the idea that we're in a long-term cooling trend, and that's certainly my understanding.
And there are examples of this. Just I think 2 weeks ago in I think it was in the state of in Ontario in Canada, there was something like 13 localities with the coldest temperatures ever recorded. And from the Washington Post just the other day, much of New York and the northern half of New England have seen an extremely snowy start to the winter. Snowfall totals across New York and New England have surpassed 1 to 2 feet in many areas. This record and near record November snowfall has been caused by the same general weather pattern that led to record rainfall in parts of the mid-Atlantic into eastern New England and so on.
Yeah, that's right. And these are weather events, not climate. I mean, climate is a very long-term thing. However, all of these small things stack up, and I think it's important at this time where there's a lot of media bias towards warm events, and yet much less media coverage of cold events, and nonetheless there are some very, very cold weather events happening on the planet at the moment. We mentioned before on the show the documentary The Cloud Mystery, which is on YouTube. very well worth a watch if you're questioning the mainstream idea of long-term global warming and want to see some scientific evidence to the contrary. The Cloud Mystery is recommended.
And of course, I already mentioned this morning that from yesterday, well, today, I guess, the time is as now in Poland, almost 195 countries will meet in Poland, one of the most polluted coal mining regions in Europe, to agree on the rules for implementing a landmark deal to cut carbon emissions called since the Paris Agreement. So that's interesting because, how much of the deeper information do they take into account? Not enough. Probably that's what we would argue.
Yeah, well, as we've discussed many times on the show before, one of the key issues here is with this values shift from the scientific industrial era into the relativistic sixth layer, which is characterized by compassion, as we're just saying. There's a strong swing to emotional influence. A lot of different things happen during this transition between layer 5 and layer 6. One of the things is our attention is turned inward, and we go on a sort of a personal healing adventure. And you see that certainly in our local area here, where there's a huge focus on personal development and healing, and that's an example of this dynamic as we shift into layer 6 of our attention turning inwards and wanting to heal ourselves in preparation for creating a solid platform for the big leap in consciousness, which comes between 6 and 7. But that, I guess, emotional viewpoint, emotional perspective on the world also starts to flavour things like science as well. And so science is being impacted in a big way, where scientists' fears and concerns for future events, possible future events, not certain future events, is starting to impact the way that they're doing science. And even in simple ways such as, there's very clear mainstream widespread concern at the moment around the issue of global warming. And so that is tending to make scientists look to research and seek evidence of global warming, okay, and then finding multiple warming events, and they're putting that picture together and saying, okay, we look like we're in a warming trend here, but the absolute sort of bottom line science underpinning this whole idea is still very uncertain, and this is almost never reported in the media. And as an example, there was a recent article published by Martin Armstrong, who's a financial forecaster that we often talk about on the show. And Martin is writing about a scientist called Professor Valentina Zarkova, who's one of the exceptions here when it comes to climate research, except she's not a climate scientist. And this is quite often the case at the moment, is that these breakthroughs in understanding are coming outside the narrow field of reference of, for example, climate science. And so she's been studying the sun, and she's in particular been studying the sun's climate and its solar magnetic field.
Yeah, the magnetic fields.
And she's found these what are called dynamo waves, so wave patterns on the surface of the sun itself.
Quadruple magnetic sources.
That's the one. And she's been able to determine the existence of very long cycles of activity in these wave patterns on the sun itself.
350 to 400 year cycles.
Yeah, and the curve that she created from her study was able to be extended out to long-term predictions, like on a millennial timescale, thousands of years. And her findings from that predictive curve equate remarkably with what we already know about long-term climate patterns and events like the Maunder minimum from around 1645 to 715, and earlier climate and solar minimums from, for example, the 1200s, the 1000s, and even right back to around about between 10 and 400 BC during the Roman warm period. And those findings of hers then correlate with a pattern that Martin Armstrong found looking at economic activity, because what he found in his detailed historical study of economic activity is that it waxes and wanes with the weather. Like when we have very, very cold periods, human activity slows down, economic activity slows down, and vice versa. And so he's found that even though he wasn't looking at climate in any way, he was simply looking at economic trends and economic performance, when he put together what he calls the economic confidence model, which is a long-term graph which comprises a compilation of a number of different wave patterns. He found that it equated exactly to the solar pattern, the solar cycles. And so now he's found that that pattern and the equation that he sees also equates to this solar wave activity documented by Professor Zarkova. And what it all points to, of course, is a long-term cooling trend and an impending mini ice age.
Intense, and as we've said a number of times with this show before, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't get rid of coal. Another report in Reuters talks about that 40% of the world's coal plants are operating at a loss due to high fuel costs. That's kind of funny, isn't it? High fuel costs, and that proportion could rise to nearly 75% by 2040. Which is pretty amazing. The London-based Carbon Tracker analysed the profitability of 6,685 coal plants around the world, representing 95% of operating capacity and 90% of capacity under construction. And their analysis shows a least cost power system without coal should be seen as an economic inevitability rather than a clean and green nicety, which is interesting in itself. Just the economics of power is shifting on this planet. Irrespective, you could argue, of where the climate's going. On Sunday, as I've already said, that these countries, all these countries are meeting in Poland. But this is interesting because that whole confidence in things is what you're talking about when we talk about when scientists talk about global warming and for economic, for all sorts of reasons, find themselves focusing on that. And possibly ignoring other science. The same is also true, of course, in the coal industry, generally speaking, that coal still, in a country like Australia, is seen as somehow the saviour. We've seen Adani claiming that they're about to start a small version of their coal mine up in the Galilee Basin and others there. And yet the truth is, economically, that these things actually don't stack up anymore.
Yeah, and I think the truth is too that it's not seen as a saviour. It's just that there is economic pressure on the government to support the coal industry. That's really the bottom line. Is the mining industry is extremely influential. It puts a lot of money into political donations and is capable of manipulating the media, as we saw in the case of Kevin Rudd. So it's a matter of who's got the money has a lot of influence at the moment. But Lee Carroll said during his talk, just to reinforce something that you said, that the fact that we may be in a long-term global cooling trend is not an argument to stop reducing our fossil fuels, because there's no reason why we shouldn't reduce and perhaps completely stop our use of fossil fuels and replace it with renewable energy sources.
Well, I mean, it's very exciting that science is now finding and enabling the use of renewable energies, of natural energies, of solar, of wind. And the future will also see more use, I'd imagine, of magnetic energy, of gravitational energy, of other energies that we're not even tuned in with yet. And yet, of course, science is starting to investigate these very places, and we're starting to see very accelerated results of that kind of science emerging on the planet. So it's time to really, I think, accept that the change is going to be much faster than even those of us who kind of understand that change is fast and speeding up, even then we're not going to catch up very easily with the potential of what is coming through the pipeline of, as I think as you said, that as we think networks, as we think connections, as we think complexity, more and more network complex systems emerge that actually enable scientific change on the planet.
That's right, as solutions. Yeah, and it's also it's about time that we started to pick apart the different issues as well, which often get conflated. Like the idea of global warming is conflated with the issue of atmospheric pollution from fossil fuels.
Yeah,
we need to pick those issues apart and say, regardless of whether we're warming or cooling, we should still clean up our act.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for your text. There's a text someone has sent in a picture, video message. We can't actually get that on here, so I'm not sure what you're trying to send there. A bit of a lighthearted relief here, or you could argue. You may have seen that outgoing president of Mexico, Enrique Pena Nieto, suddenly last week awarded President Trump's advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Mexico's highest, greatest honor. That is called the Order of the Aztec Eagle. The Mexican population is absolutely stunned, given that Trump calls them all rapists and criminals, and of course wants to build his wall. And usually this award of the Aztec Eagle is an honor reserved for foreigners who make a significant contribution to Mexico's well-being. In this case, apparently it was for a trade agreement, which is supposed to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, which was dumped by President Trump. And that was expected to be signed. I'm not sure if it was signed at the G20 meeting that has just happened. But I find this to be an incredible joke that, these sort of medals, these hollow medals, are really somehow a metaphor for the hollow society from which societies and structures from which they come, that layer of consciousness that is passing away, and pinning medals on each other is a kind of example of this last ditch attempt to have some kind of egoic satisfaction or something. At the same time, the USA Today, which is an American sort of mid-range, ordinary kind of paper, it's not a rag, it's not right-wing, it's not good journalism, but it's been around a long time. Strangely, it's come out this week, given that the Department of Justice in the US inadvertently named Julian Assange in a court filing in an unrelated case, suggesting that they have prepared charges against the WikiLeaks founder under seal. USA Today has come out and suggested that Assange should not be charged with anything, but actually should receive the Medal of Freedom. I found that to be really interesting, going against the sort of grain in America. And you said this is kind of an example of this sort of split in values that occurs as we're changing into a new layer, a new value system.
Yeah, so we've got this slingshot effect going on, whereby in the transition between the modern values and the relativistic or postmodern values that come with layer 6, there's often a backslide to layer 4, which is agricultural, authoritarian, very rigid value set, very black and white, without any shades of grey in between. And you can see, the sort of harsh, judgmental attitudes that have been expressed towards Assange and WikiLeaks, rather. Have often been very black and white and just said, look, this is wrong. There's no discussion about it. It's just fundamentally wrong, and it's he's an enemy of the state and all this kind of stuff. And then from that sort of reflects this rigid layer 4 value set, and then from layer 5 kind of twists and bends and changes values to suit itself, so it'll say whatever it wants to say to get whatever it wants.
What as it said in this article, Trump loved WikiLeaks during his campaign for the presidency. In fact, he mentioned WikiLeaks some 160 times or so.
And that's a great example of these movable values that are a characteristic of layer 5, where, depending on what your personal outcome is, your personal idea of success, then you'll grab whatever's nearby and twist it to fit with your story, and that's a great example. And then with the emerging layer 6, we've got, as we've been talking about earlier in the show, this idea of compassion, extending compassion to people and understanding, having sympathy for their circumstances. And we're getting a spread across at least these 3 value sets, sometimes even further in scope to further value sets further back down the chain. And we're seeing things like this example that you've quoted from USA Today, where there's an organisation that doesn't usually express itself like this, doesn't usually express these kinds of feelings, but is suddenly showing up with a different set of values. And it's interesting, it adds to this rich mix that we've got going on globally at the moment, which is, building the evolutionary tension for change.
Yeah, it's interesting too, in this article from USA Today, it goes on, the Assange indictment is far more threatening than Trump tweets snarling at CNN. The American Council of Civil Liberties warns that prosecuting Assange for WikiLeaks publishing operations would be unconstitutional and sets a dangerous precedent for US journalists who routinely violate foreign secrecy laws to deliver information vital to the public interest. Trevor Timm of the Freedom of the Press Foundation declared, any charges brought against WikiLeaks for their publishing activities pose a profound and incredibly dangerous threat to press freedoms. It is difficult to appreciate WikiLeaks. This is a key point here, very interesting. It is difficult to appreciate WikiLeaks without recognizing how federal secrecy has become far more pervasive and dangerous since 9/11. If someone had massively leaked US government documents on Iraq in January 2003, the Bush administration campaign for war might have been thwarted. The federal government last year made almost 50 million decisions to classify information. And it finishes this article saying, politicians and federal agencies have long recognized that, quote, what people don't know won't hurt the government.
That's right. And these are all examples of attempts by the layer 5 mindset to hang on to control in the face of this emerging values revolution which is going on globally.
Yes.
And we should expect to see that get worse and worse and worse until the point where it reaches a tipping point. And the majority of people say no, just like they did in Victoria recently.
Yes. And before we move on to the local politics as an example of this, just one text here which is relevant to our last conversation. We are talking about global emergency and climate breakdown. In some regions, extreme cold, others heat, drought here, floods there, etc. The phrase global warming is so last century, whoever is using it. Global emergency, climate breakdown.
It's a very good point, actually, because whether it's going to get extremely hot or extremely cold, either way, we should be concerned and we need to prepare for it.
Yep.
And one of the biggest dangers at the moment is that if we get carried away with this global warming idea and it starts to get very cold, we're actually moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's right. Victorian elections last so long ago now. You were in Tasmania when they were occurring, and
yes, I saw it from the other side.
The other side of the small ditch. Yeah. So what do we think about that? Because an extraordinary result, and for those of us who are definitely a bit more left wing like ourselves, a good result overall. Although if you were a bit further to the left and a green voter, then you'd probably be a little less than happy because the Greens didn't do as well as they should have, given that trend towards the left, you could say. Or is it a trend to the left? What is it?
You know, I think this left-wing, right-wing thing is so last century, really.
Couldn't agree more.
It's really, it almost harks back to like layer 4 values of, good or bad. This is my good, that's your good, left or right, and really, neither left or right wing politicians have all the answers at the moment, and that is so clear. It's part of the reason why we're seeing the fragmentation of the major political parties is because neither left wing or right wing solutions really cut it.
Yeah, but what did cut it in the Victorian elections, in my opinion, is that the Labor Party did not descend in the same way to the blame game, to the what's the word I'm looking for?
Personal attack.
Yeah, the personal attack, particularly on Somalians, on street gangs, on young people, on terrorists, so-called.
Fear-mongering.
Fear-mongering, basically. Yeah. And I think that was a really big shift, because, of course, the Labor Party can also play that game quite a lot. Arguably, though, the coalition, and particularly the right wing of the coalition across the country, very much focuses in this sort of law and order, to put it under a big banner, the law and order issues. The Labor Party just doesn't seem to be buying that game anymore. And I would suggest that that's a large part of why they were so successful in Victoria and the Victorian elections. Victorians tend to be fairly intelligent people, in my experience, overall.
Yeah, if we look at the trends associated with this value shift, we're looking at decentralisation of power as one of the issues. So any political party that's looking to increase the centralisation of power,
yes,
and this secrecy law stuff is just a classic example of that. Any party that's doing that is moving in the wrong direction. They're actually opposing the whole global tide of change. Any trend that is moving towards rebuilding community is in tune with the global trend. So, I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to actually work out how your policy should be shaped at this time, because there's a massive, massive global shift moving in a particular direction.
Yeah. You mentioned the encryption bill there, which in this last week federally of sitting Parliament for the year, the Morrison government is trying to push through the encryption bill. But the Labor Party and others have some serious questions about some elements of this, that it doesn't have enough safeguards. And even the President of the Senate has said that the legislation may erode parliamentary privilege. For example, tech industry leaders say that their global reputation is on the line. And all of these aspects of this control, this attempt at, to me, it's a sort of last-ditch attempt at control that the powers that be in that sort of layer 4, 5 dominant paradigm that has been on the planet for a long time is desperately trying to hold on for dear life to controlling us all and not letting us get away with actually getting together and actually talking amongst ourselves and actually finding some new solutions. Just like the school children on last Friday in Australia who came out for climate change and as one topic, but just the notion that it's our future and your decisions as 50, 60, 70-year-old men mostly are impacting us at 16, 17, 18, and you're not considering us at all. You're not considering the community of humanity in total.
Very refreshing to see the electoral result in Victoria, because it's an indication that Victorians have chosen not to continue with this regression to older value sets and more extreme views, that they've actually said, no, that's enough. We want to go in another direction. It's very, very promising. And it's particularly promising because it shows that we're not necessarily going down the same road as the USA right now with politics.
Yeah, that's good. You are now tuned to FutureSense with Steve McDonald and Nyck Jeanes, and a few other pieces. Neurohacker Collective is one thing that we look at times, and an article on psychobiotics, bacteria to brighten your mood, is an interesting one. The microbiome is a word you probably may know now, but 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, it may not have been a term that you were familiar with. It's a term for the vast ecology of resident microorganisms that live in symbiotic relationship with us. And I guess in that sense, it's that part of our awareness, the complexity of our beingness, this whole area. And you would think that, perhaps that rich and fermented foods and beverages are fairly recent, but they actually go way back and can be traced back as far as about 8,000 BC to the origins of fermented milk, kefir, attributed to shepherds in the North Caucasus Mountains, for example. The exact origins of all of these things are lost in the annals of time, but Neolithic vessels point to intentional fermentation of fruit, rice, or honey beverages being a common practice even 10,000 years ago. So this process increases the bioavailability of nutrients. Fermented foods contain beneficial microbes that aid in digestion and promote the growth of healthy gut flora. But can these bacteria also affect mood? And that's a big question now.
What I find fascinating about these new scientific discoveries and trends is that they correlate so nicely with the large-scale value shifts and ways of thinking that are changing.
Yes, indeed.
Evolutionary shift that's going on. And of course, I think I mentioned before, one of the big trends is a trend towards community on a large scale. Yeah. And here we are discovering these communities inside ourselves at the same time. It's just beautiful. It is beautiful. As above, so below, as they say.
Can you feel it, folks out there? Can you tune to that? Isn't it a beautiful thing, that resonance, the as above, so below? Really good.
Absolutely. And it turns out that these bacteria inside of us have the capacity to generate many neurotransmitters and neuromodulators found in the brain, like, for example, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA, acetylcholine. So, in other words, they can have a considerable effect on our mental faculties and help rebalance and modulate the levels of these things in our system.
You are what you eat, and not just your physical body, your mood, your psychology.
That's right. And there are new trends, in psychiatry at the moment to look at actually diet and supplements, as you've been saying, to affect our psychological state. Very, very interesting in our psychiatric state as well. And of course, dysfunctions in the gut-brain axis are being linked to conditions like anxiety, depression, autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, neurodegenerative disorders. So it's amazing to think that we may be able to address these conditions simply through dietary practices and using some of these things like kombucha and kefir and the like.
And there's a number of studies. A study, for example, by John Kryon, a neuroscientist at University College Cork in Ireland, found that two varieties of bifidobacterium produced by his lab were more effective than escitalopram, which is Lexapro, some pharmaceutical antidepressant, at treating anxious and depressive behaviour in lab mouse strain known for pathological anxiety. Poor mice. They're known for pathological anxiety. That's a shame.
Yeah, they're called hiding, don't they, those laboratory mice?
Things, God, sweet things. I have compassion for those mice.
Me too.
But, there you go. So we're on a real new cutting edge of science in this arena, aren't we?
That's right. And more bad news for Big Pharma. Isn't it wonderful?
Oh, yeah. You're going down. It's amazing how these old structures just do not want to die. I wonder why. Pretty obvious, really. But it's a very exciting field indeed. And something we're going to keep an eye on, because I think most of us in this region are on one kind of diet or another, one kind of supplement or another, one kind of theory or idea, but all of them are sort of coming into this notion that we are a total living system, a complex system where many parts are interacting all the time, and that you can have influence by feeding yourself the appropriate psychobiotics at the appropriate time. And I find it to be really fascinating and important area of human discovery at this time.
That's right. It's the start of a psychobiotic revolution, no doubt.
We like to talk about psychobiotics. And have you got another piece about this?
Yeah,
that's the other thing.
Another one along the same lines
right.
of this as above, so below. You know, here we are like building new networks globally, and we're discovering new networks at the same time. It's like as our mindset, our perspective on reality shifts to embrace these different concepts like networks, for example, and the sixth layer that we're moving into right now is very network-centric.
Yeah.
Here we are starting to take notice of networks inside our bodies. And so there's another article which I came across in Quantum magazine about long overlooked tunneling nanotubes and other bridges between cells, acting as conduits for sharing RNA, proteins, and even whole organelles, which are little things that live inside cells. And basically, in short, what it's saying is that these things have kind of been seen once or twice, but nobody's really understood what they were. Some of our methods for preparing cellular tissue for observation destroy them, so that's one of the reasons why they haven't really become well known up until now. But a scientist recently started to look at them more closely and found that these little networks involving what they call microtubules and also nanotubes extending like little tunnels from one cell to neighboring cells, they are networks that are created during a healing process whereby healthy cells extend these little communication tubes to unhealthy cells nearby to help them out, basically. And I mean, you know, what another as above, so below wonderful example of how we're creating networks all around the world at the moment to reach out to people who are perhaps less in need or, you know, in certainly in need of connection and communication. And here it is happening inside ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, this is really an enormous theme. We've found, we've seen, I guess, certainly in the last 50 years. I'm thinking now I'm looking at a poster on the wall in the studio here for the Woodford Folk Festival, and then I went back and I thought about Woodstock, and I thought about this, how we've collectively come together in this way only in the last 50 years in these big celebratory, musically oriented, usually based around music, which is another example of what connects us, because it's universal. Music, to one degree or another, it's pretty universal. So these physical places where we've come to gather, to celebrate, to be together, to create community, these internal practices that we've begun to become more and more fashionable to, and functional as well, of looking after our bodies, looking after our minds, our spirits, of taking into our bodies the things that actually support us rather than the things that seem to just destroy us or to inhibit our natural functioning. So all of these movements are sort of collectively coming and expressing this, as you're saying, this new form of beingness, where we are not only engaged on a deeper level with levels of ourselves, but through that with community members inside and outside.
Yeah, and also, you know, building new understandings of reality from sort of micro nano scale right up to
because it has to come from there, doesn't it? Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in a more simplistic version of or appreciation of life, the universe, and everything. But as you go deeper into yourself, into the complexity within the self, and see the complexity outside, I find a great relief in that. I mean, some people are overwhelmed by it, and that's a part of the process, isn't it? The confusion and the overwhelm of too much information, too many connections. I don't know what's important. How do I discern rather than judge, but discern what actually works for me, what's true for me, and what's supportive of me in this time. All these elements are sort of coming to the fore. I think most people now can relate to that. Most people in this region, anyway, in this sort of more, I guess, layer 6 region of where connectivity has this quality to it of enhancing our journey, of our spiritual journey, if you will.
It does. It does. And Claire Gray's work talks about the importance of deep human connection at this particular layer that's emerging. You know, it's one of the key things, in the same way that personal success is a key driver in the fifth modern scientific industrial layer. Deep human connection is the key driver in layer 6.
Yeah. When we jump to, just quickly for the last few minutes here, that when we move to the second tier, as Graves expressed it, and we're now on that edge, or moving towards that edge of layer 6, many of us, and certainly accelerating through layer 6 as we enter and come through it to that point. I often see it as a sort of an abyss before us, before that momentous leap, because it is such a big change that's coming there. But you're talking about that need in layer 6. What is it in layer 7 as you jump across the ridge there? Because suddenly it's not about community in the same way anymore, and yet it's very global. It's a totality.
It is, absolutely. And remember that these layers are not discrete, different things.
Like Russian dolls nested inside each other.
You know, so the previous things don't go away. So, and 7, because 7 involves the development of this amazing multi-dimensional awareness, all of a sudden it becomes very consciously aware in a way that we have never been before of the previous layers. When we're going through layers 1 through 6, we're aware of our own state, our own subjective experience in each layer, but we're not aware that the layer actually exists.
Yes. Yeah.
All we see is people who are like us and people who are not like us. And it's only when we get to 7 that we can see the layer, the strata, and we can actually understand that, wow, I've just grown through that, you know, and this is all still inside me, and I can actually identify with each one of these. I can see a part of my life in the past where I was that, and so it's a completely new realm. It's so different. It's hard to describe in the same terms, but one of the key drivers there is, I guess, responding to the question, what do I do with this new understanding I have? You know, all of a sudden I can see a new angle on the entire world and the entire, you know, human experience, and I have this access to this amazing understanding of these different operating systems, operating frequencies, each of which I know from experience, and each of which I can move into and out of and express whenever I need to. And, you know, what do I do with this amazing multi-dimensional sort of witness perspective that I have over the entire picture of what's going on the planet? And what that normally gives rise to is this drive to want to make things better on a large scale. This drive to want to attend to the most urgent things that need attending to on the planet, and ensure the safe and enjoyable continuity of human existence on the planet without things, you know, running off the rails. Because it's certainly in the lead up to the shift, during the shift to 7, it certainly looks like things are running off the rails in many respects. Yeah,
I mean, it's not likely to be easy, but it may be easier than we think. Possibly.
It will be, without a doubt. I mean, seen from a first tier consciousness perspective,
looks very ugly.
Layer 6 or down, it looks really, really bad, and it looks like we don't have the solutions. And it only starts to look like we actually have the solutions when we make this big leap in consciousness and we can see the complexity of it all.
Paradox, folks, and a little bit of advice from your FutureSense brothers, sense makers, is make yourself feel more comfortable with paradox. Work on that. Work on actually allowing paradox to exist in you. I thoroughly enjoy the notion of paradox personally. It always seems to me, I used to say this for a long time, it's almost like paradox is the language of the divine. If you're in the presence of paradox, perhaps you're in the presence of a deeper level of what is really trans-rational truth, but truth nevertheless, something else there that can be addressed. Doesn't mean you have an answer. You don't have to have an answer to it. It's a direction perhaps that emerges from that understanding, like, oh, I can hold this and I can hold the contrary both at the same time. It's kind of very exciting.
Certainly is.
We'll say goodbye. Thanks for joining us here on FutureSense. We'll be with you next Monday morning here. Thanks from Steve.
Until then.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to FutureSense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. FutureSense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.